The light in the Russell Senate office building was the color of old parchment, a tired late-afternoon gold that filtered through the grand arched windows and did little to warm the marble chill of the corridors. Inside Suite 487, Senator Marcus Sterling stood not at his desk, but before a corkboard that covered an entire wall. It was a chaotic tapestry of faces, statistics, and handwritten notes, the visual representation of a crusade. At its center was the neatly typed title, S-1410, the Second Chance Act. Sterling was a man built of restless energy, former prosecutor from a sprawling, bruised city who had seen the machinery of justice from the inside and decided it was grinding the wrong grist. His suit jacket was off, his tie loosened. The sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled up to his forearms. He traced the line of a red yarn connecting a photograph of a 20-year-old named Leo, sentenced to 15 years for a nonviolent drug offense, to a stark statistic about recidivism rates for inmates without access to educational programs. He could feel the boy's lost years like a weight in his own chest. His mission was not merely legislative, it was restorative, an attempt to recalibrate the very scales of American justice, from punishment to potential. He saw futures being extinguished by the blunt instrument of mandatory minimums, families fractured, communities hollowed out. His belief in the bill was elemental, a conviction that ran deeper than politics, down to the marrow of his faith in human redemption. 3 floors down and a world away in ideological distance, Senator Julian Vance sat in a chamber of stillness. His office in the Dirksen building was a monument to order and principle. The walls were lined not with corkboards but with mahogany shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound legal texts and philosophical treatises. The air smelled of old paper and discipline. Vance, a former ophthalmologist from a state of rolling hills and unyielding tradition, saw the world with a clinician's precision. To him, society was a complex organism, and crime was a pathology that required aggressive, decisive treatment. Leniency was not compassion. It was malpractice, a contagion allowed to fester. He held a single sheet of paper, a summary of the Second Chance Act, in a grip that was preternaturally steady. He wasn't reading the text anymore. He was dissecting its implications. Each clause about reducing sentences, each line item for rehabilitation funding, was, in his calculus, a betrayal. A betrayal of the victims whose lives were irrevocably altered. A betrayal of the law-abiding citizens who looked to the government for a shield. A betrayal of the very concept of consequence. His opposition was not born of cruelty but of a severe, almost monastic devotion to the principle of order. He saw Sterling's bill not as a lifeline to the fallen, but as a leak in the dike. A single crack through which the waters of chaos would inevitably surge. On his desk, next to a framed copy of the Constitution, sat a small, silver-framed photograph of a smiling young man, his older brother. A picture Vance never touched but whose presence was a constant, silent testament to the stakes as he saw them. The battle began, not on the Senate floor, but in the hushed, wood-paneled confines of the Judiciary Committee hearing room. The space was a pressure cooker, the air thick with the silent hum of television cameras and the anticipation of conflict. Sterling's team had prepped their witnesses meticulously. A sociologist presented data-rich charts showing the disparate impact of current sentencing laws on minority communities. An economist detailed the staggering cost of mass incarceration versus the economic benefits of a rehabilitated workforce. Then came the emotional centerpiece, Leo's mother. A woman whose face was a roadmap of worry and sleepless nights. She did not speak of policy. She placed a worn photograph of her son's high school graduation on the witness table. She spoke of a good boy who made a stupid, catastrophic mistake. She spoke of visiting him behind plexiglass, of watching the light in his eyes dim with each passing year. As she spoke, Sterling watched the committee. He saw flickers of empathy, nods of understanding. He felt a current of momentum, a fragile hope taking root. He leaned forward, his posture a silent signal of support, his gaze fixed on the mother, willing her strength to permeate the room. When it was Vance's turn to question, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder. more analytical. He did not address the mother directly at first. He thanked her for her courage. His tone was somber, respectful, yet a razor's edge lay just beneath the surface. He then turned his attention to a thick binder before him. He did not look at the photograph of the smiling graduate. He looked at the police report. He read in a calm, measured voice the details of the quantity of narcotics involved. The location of the arrest near a public school. He wasn't cross-examining the mother. He was cross-examining the narrative of youthful indiscretion. He methodically transformed Leo from a lost boy into a calculated risk, a potential threat to other people's children. He asked the sociologist if she could guarantee with 100% certainty that a man like Leo released early would not reoffend. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and toxic. He had not raised his voice, had not displayed a flicker of overt aggression, but he had surgically implanted a seed of fear into the heart of the debate. The hearing was a microcosm of the war to come. Sterling argued for the individual, for the capacity for change, for the soul of the nation. Vance argued for the collective, for the sanctity of the law, for the safety of the flock. The bill, by a narrow, contentious vote, was reported out of committee. A small victory, but Sterling knew the true fight lay ahead, on the open floor, where ideologies would clash under the full glare of the national spotlight. In the weeks that followed, the Capitol became a chessboard. Sterling and his staff lived on stale coffee and adrenaline. Their days a whirlwind of meetings with wavering senators, their nights spent refining talking points and strategizing. He met a centrist from a swing state in a quiet corner of the Senate dining room, appealing to his sense of fiscal responsibility, highlighting the cost savings of the bill. He met with a veteran senator, a lion of the old guard, in the ornate Strom-Thurmond room, speaking of legacy and the chance to enact a historic, bipartisan reform. Every conversation was a delicate dance, search for the precise key to unlock a vote. Vance, meanwhile, conducted his own campaign, a counteroffensive of quiet, unassailable logic. He met with law enforcement unions who emerged from his office to give stark warnings to the press about an emboldened criminal element. He held private briefings with victims' rights advocates, their tearful, artful stories providing the emotional ammunition for his cause. He did not need to shout. His allies did it for him, on cable news panels and talk radio shows where the bill was painted as a reckless gamble, a pro-criminal fantasy. Then, the event happened that both sides had privately dreaded and anticipated. In a Midwestern city, a man recently released from prison under a state-level early release program, a precursor to the kind of reform Sterling was championing, committed a brutal, high-profile robbery that left a shop owner critically injured. The story exploded. Vance was in his office when the news broke. Watching the chyron flash across the bottom of a 24-hour news screen, he felt no glee, no sense of "I told you so." He felt a cold, grim vindication. It was the physical manifestation of his abstract fears, the data point made flesh and blood. His communications director entered, breathless, holding a tablet with a dozen different headlines. Vance simply nodded, a silent instruction. Within the hour, his office had released a statement. A masterwork of somber condemnation that never mentioned Sterling or the Second Chance Act by name, but drew a clear, unassailable line between the policy of leniency and the reality of violence. The narrative, once a complex debate about justice and mercy, was now being flattened into a simple, terrifying story about a victim in a hospital bed. The tide turned. Sterling could feel it in the hallways. Colleagues who had been warm and receptive were now evasive, their eyes darting away. The fragile coalition he had painstakingly built began to fray. The phone calls became harder. The swing state centrist was now deeply concerned. The old lion was re-evaluating. Fear, Sterling knew, was a far more potent motivator than hope. He saw his crusade, his life's work, slipping through his fingers. Undone by a single act of violence hundreds of miles away, he pushed back. He went on television, his face etched with fatigue and frustration, trying to reintroduce nuance into a debate that no longer had room for it. He argued that the actions of one man should not condemn thousands to hopeless futures, that the system itself was still broken. But his words felt like whispers against a hurricane. He was no longer setting the terms of the debate. he was reacting to them. The corkboard in his office now seemed less like a battle plan and more like a memorial. To a dying cause, he would stand for hours, staring at the face of Leo, feeling as if he were failing him personally. The day of the final debate arrived under a sky the color of slate. The Senate chamber was electric with a nervous energy that transcended the usual political theater. Tourists in the gallery leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. This was not a procedural vote on a budget amendment. It was a verdict on the character of the country. Sterling spoke first. He stood at his desk, the well of the Senate before him, and he did not use notes. He spoke from that place of marrow-deep conviction. Told the story of Leo, not as a statistic, but as a human being. Spoke of the promise of America, a promise. That was not just about success, but about second chances. He asked his colleagues to legislate from a place of courage, not fear. His voice, usually so commanding, held a note of pleading, a raw vulnerability that hushed the chamber. It was a powerful, heartfelt appeal to the better angels of their nature. Then, it was Vance's turn. He rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. He walked to the center of the chamber, a place reserved for moments of high consequence. He began to speak, his voice not loud but resonant, filling every corner of the vast room. He did not speak of statistics or reports. He spoke of a covenant, the sacred trust between a government and its people to provide for the common defense, to ensure domestic tranquility. He painted a picture of a nation of quiet heroes, the parent working 2 jobs, the small business owner locking up at night, the child waiting for a bus. These, he argued, were the forgotten victims of a misplaced compassion. Their safety was the highest moral good. He spoke for 20 minutes, his argument building with the inexorable force of a rising river. He never mentioned the crime in the Midwest, but its specter haunted his every word. He spoke of the line between order and chaos, and how the Second Chance Act would blur that line, would erase it. And then, for the first time in his public career, he made it personal. He spoke of loss, of the unhealable wound left by violence, of the empty chair at a family table. He did not name his brother, but his voice cracked with a genuine, unfeigned grief that was more powerful than any statistic. He looked at his colleagues, his gaze sweeping across the room, and he asked a simple question. Whose side are you on? The side of the risk, or the side of the innocent? When he finished, a profound silence held the chamber. It was a masterful performance, a speech that would be studied for years, a perfect crystallization of a political philosophy. He had taken Sterling's complex, nuanced argument and crushed it with a single, powerful hammer of fear and righteous anger. Sat at his desk, his hands clasped before him, and he knew I had lost. He had appealed to their angels, but Vance had spoken to their demons. The demons had won. The roll call began, the clerk's voice a dispassionate drone that felt too Sterling, like a funeral dirge. Mr. Akaka... Mr. Barrasso. The ayes and nays fell like stones, building 2 distinct piles. Sterling's whip kept a running tally on a small pad, but he didn't need to see it. He could feel the outcome in the shifting atmosphere of the room. The waverers had broken for Vance. The wall of fear had held. The final tally was announced. 48 in favor, 52 opposed. The bill was defeated. A quiet smattering of applause broke out from Vance's side of the aisle, quickly shushed. It was not a moment for celebration, but for sober relief. Vance stood, impassive, his face a mask of stern duty fulfilled. He accepted a few handshakes, his nods brief and economical. He had not won a game, he had averted a disaster. Sterling remained seated for a long moment as the chamber began to empty. The energy drained away, leaving behind the stale air of defeat. His staff approached his desk, their faces funereal. He managed a weak, tired smile. He told them they fought a good fight. He told them to be proud. But as he walked alone back through the marble corridors, the weight of the lost futures, the weight of Leo and the thousands like him, pressed down on him, heavier than any building of stone. He had flown close to the sun, fueled by hope, and had been cast back to earth. Weeks turned into a month. The political world with its voracious short-term memory, moved on. The Second Chance Act became a footnote, a case study for future political science students on the power of narrative. Senator Vance's stock had never been higher. His floor speech was replayed endlessly, his stoic, principled stand lauded as a portrait of leadership. Whispers of a future presidential run grew louder, more insistent. He was the man of the hour. The guardian at the gate. He was working late one Tuesday night. The city a glittering tapestry of light outside his office window. Rain lashed against the thick panes of glass, a rhythmic, soothing sound that helped him focus. He was reviewing an appropriations bill, his pen making sharp, decisive notes in the margins. It was in these quiet hours that he felt most himself, a solitary sentinel holding the line against the fiscal and moral laxity he saw as the nation's primary ailments. The photograph of his brother sat in its usual place, a silent companion. In his vigil, the man convicted of his brother's murder, a career criminal the press had dubbed the East End Butcher, was serving 3 consecutive life sentences without parole in a supermax facility. He was the ghost that had shaped Julian Vance's life, the embodiment of the irredeemable evil that his entire political philosophy was designed to combat. The certainty of that man's guilt was the bedrock upon which his worldview was built. A soft knock at the door broke his concentration. A young legislative aide, a bright, nervous boy named Peter, stood in the doorway, clutching a large, flat manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "Senator, apologies for the late hour. This was just delivered by a courier," they said. It was urgent and personal. Vance took the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy with no return address. It's just his name and office, typed neatly on a label. He dismissed the aide with a nod and slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was not a letter, but a bound report, over 100 pages thick. The cover was plain white cardstock. The title read, "In Re, the Conviction of Daniel Miller." A review by the Justice Integrity Project. Vance's breath caught. Daniel Miller, the butcher. The Justice Integrity Project was one of those shoestring budget, cooter outfits he despised, filled with bleeding heart lawyers who spent their days trying to spring convicted felons on technicalities. He almost tossed the entire thing into the wastebasket. It was an insult, a provocation, a morbid curiosity. A flicker of something he couldn't name made him open it. The first page was a summary. His eyes scanned the clinical, dispassionate text, ... newly uncovered evidence. Significant doubts as to the veracity of the original conviction. Potential miscarriage of justice, ... It was boilerplate nonsense. He flipped further, his irritation growing, and then he saw it. Page 12. A forensic lab report from a private firm in Virginia, dated 2 weeks prior. The report detailed the results of a DNA test conducted on a small piece of fabric, a bloodstain found under the victim's fingernails, his brother's fingernails. Evidence that the original police report had listed as collected but not analyzed due to budget constraints. The DNA profile did not match Daniel Miller. It did not match his brother. It matched an unknown third party. Vance's famously steady hands began to tremble. A cold sweat bloomed on his forehead. This was impossible. A mistake. He turned the page, and then another. The report was a systematic demolition of the case that had defined his life. There was a sworn, notarized affidavit from the state's star witness. A jailhouse informant who had claimed Miller confessed the crime to him. In the affidavit, the man, now old and dying of cancer, recanted his entire testimony. He described in painstaking detail how 2 detectives had offered him a drastically reduced sentence on his own charges in exchange for the story they wanted. He provided names, dates, details of their conversations that lent his recantation a terrifying credibility. There was a timeline, meticulously reconstructed from old work logs and gas station receipts. The original, overwhelmed public defender had never pursued. It showed that Daniel Miller, a man with a low IQ and a history of petty, nonviolent crime, had been working a double shift at a loading dock 40 miles away at the time of the murder. The alibi was solid, verifiable. Vance felt the air leave his lungs. The mahogany-paneled office, his sanctuary of order, began to feel like a cage. The room was spinning. He stumbled back from his desk, the reports slipping from his grasp, its pages scattering across the deep blue of the Persian rug. Each page was a piece of shrapnel, shredding the narrative he had built for himself. For his career, for the country, he wasn't just a senator who had defeated a bill. He was a man whose entire moral crusade, the very public identity that had propelled him to the heights of power, was fueled by a fiction. The righteous anger he had channeled on the Senate floor, the raw, authentic grief that had swayed the final crucial votes, it was all based on a lie. A lie told by desperate cops, a desperate informant, and a justice system too broken to notice. Daniel Miller wasn't the East End butcher. He was just another Leo, another faceless man fed into the merciless gears of the machine. A machine that Vance had just fought with all his strength and conviction to fortify and protect. He collapsed into his leather chair, his gaze falling on the scattered pages, the DNA report, the recantation, the alibi. And then his eyes landed on the silver-framed photograph of his brother. His smiling face was no longer a symbol of tragic, righteous victimhood. It was now an accusation. The covenant he had spoken of with such certainty, the trust between the citizen and the state, had been broken not by a criminal, but by the state itself, in his own brother's name. His victory over Marcus Sterling was complete. The second chance act was dead. The prisons would remain full, the sentences long, the path to redemption narrow and treacherous. He had won. He had held the line. And in the silent, suffocating grandeur of his office, Senator Julian Vance was confronted with the sickening, soul-crushing truth: he had become the champion of his own family's greatest injustice. The law and order he so cherished had created a monster, and he had just fed it. The rain continued to beat against the glass, each drop sounding like a hammer on a coffin nail. He was alone with his triumph, and it was indistinguishable from ruin. The hours that followed were a silent, slow-motion drowning. Senator Julian Vance did not move from his chair. The rain stopped, and the pre-dawn sky over Washington began to bleed from bruised purple into a sickly, anemic gray. The scattered pages of the report lay on his rug like fallen leaves after a storm, each one a testament to his ruin. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, was a landscape of rubble. He tried to fight it, to marshal his formidable intellect into a defense. He read the DNA report again, his ophthalmologist's eyes searching for a flaw in the methodology, a weakness in the chain of custody. Anything. There was nothing. The science was pristine, impartial, and absolute. He reread the informant's recantation, searching for the tells of a liar inconsistency, a motive for this new confession. But the confession of the lie was more detailed, more plausible than the lie itself had ever been. He felt a phantom sensation, the echo of his own voice in the Senate chamber. Whose side are you on? The side of the risk, or the side of the innocent? The words, once his armor, were now the very spear that had pierced him. He had stood before the nation and posed a false choice, built on a false premise. He had painted Daniel Miller as the risk, the embodiment of chaos. But the true chaos, he now understood, was the unchecked power of the state, the fallibility of the system he had deified. The real innocent man was not some abstract citizen waiting for a bus, but a specific man named Daniel Miller, rotting in a concrete cell because of a lie Vance had unwittingly sanctified. The sun rose. The first rays of morning light, clean and unforgiving, spilled into his office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the wreckage of his certainty on the floor. He heard the faint, distant sounds of the city waking up, the groan of traffic, the first sirens. The world was moving on, oblivious. He carefully, mechanically gathered the pages. His movements were stiff, robotic, as if his body were a machine being operated by a ghost. We placed the report back into the manila envelope and locked it in. The bottom drawer of his desk is a toxic secret hidden beneath files on agricultural subsidies and transportation infrastructure. The day began. His chief of staff, a crisp, efficient woman named Eleanor, entered with his schedule. Her face a mask of professional deference, she saw nothing amiss. To her, he was the same Senator Vance as the day before, disciplined, controlled the victor. He looked at the scheduled breakfast with donors, a committee markup on a judicial nomination, a television interview about his triumph over the reckless Second Chance Act. Each item was a fresh turn of the screw. How could he sit with donors and accept their praise? How could he vet a judge's fitness for the bench when the very bench he served had proven so profoundly unfit? How could he look into a camera and speak of justice? He went through the motions. At the breakfast, he smiled, his face feeling like a plaster cast. The donors clapped him on the back, their voices a dull roar in his ears. They praised his moral clarity, his unshakable courage. Each word of praise was an indictment. He nodded, sipped his coffee, and felt a profound, chilling detachment from the man they were describing. In the Judiciary Committee, he listened. As the nominee spoke eloquently about the importance of judicial restraint and textualism, Vance had championed this man, had seen him as a kindred spirit. Now he heard only hollow platitudes. He thought of the overwhelmed public defender who had failed to check Daniel Miller's alibi. He thought of the detectives who, in their zeal for a conviction, had suborned perjury. He thought of the judge who had banged the gavel and sealed an innocent man's fate. The system wasn't a pristine text to be interpreted. It was a messy human enterprise, susceptible to pressure, corruption, and catastrophic error. He asked no questions during the hearing, an uncharacteristic silence that raised a few eyebrows among his colleagues. He simply sat, a statue carved from ice, while a fire raged within. His internal world had been inverted. He began to see the ghost of Daniel Miller everywhere. In the face of a janitor mopping the floors of the Capitol, he saw a man whose life had been stolen. In a news report about overcrowded prisons, he no longer saw a necessary societal cost. He saw a warehouse of potential injustices. The city of Washington, once for him a symbol of power and principle, now seemed like a monument to hypocrisy. The gleaming white dome of the Capitol looked like a skull. He needed to know more. Not to disprove the report, but to understand the full scope of the abyss that had opened beneath him. He couldn't use his official staff. The risk of a leak was too great. The secret had to be contained, held close, until he knew what to do with it. He thought of a name, a man from a past life, a former law clerk of his, years ago, who had left the promise of a judicial career to become a private investigator. A brilliant, cynical man named Ben Carter who specialized in finding the things powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Vance had always disapproved of Carter's career choice, seeing it as a waste of a fine legal mind. Now, it was exactly what he needed. He made the call from a payphone, a relic he found in the dusty lower levels of Union Station, using a prepaid burner phone. He'd had a junior aide purchase for cash for an unrelated constituent matter. The cloak and dagger theatrics felt absurd, the stuff of cheap thrillers. But the paranoia was real and suffocating. Carter's voice on the other end was gravelly, unsurprised. He listened to Vance's clipped, cautious request, a discreet background check of verification of certain facts in a sensitive document without interruption. He asked no questions about the senator's sudden need for secrecy. He simply named his price, a figure that would have made Vance flinch a month ago, but which now seemed laughably insignificant. The price of truth, Vance agreed. He arranged for a dead drop of the report in a locker at a 24-hour gym in Georgetown. Felt like a conspirator in his own life. While Carter worked, Vance lived a bifurcated existence. His public life continued unabated. He gave the scheduled television interview. The host lobbed him softballs, congratulating him on standing firm for the forgotten victims. Vance recited his talking points, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. He spoke of the sanctity of the law, and a wave of nausea washed over him. As he spoke, he saw the camera's red tally light, and he imagined it was the eye of God, or worse, the eye of Daniel Miller, watching him, judging him. The performance was flawless. No one could see the cracks in the facade. His approval ratings soared. His party began to position him as the heir apparent, the future standard-bearer of their movement. He was becoming more powerful, more revered, precisely at the moment he knew himself to be a fraud. his nights were sleepless. He would sit in his silent office, the locked desk drawer containing the report feeling like a radioactive presence. He would pull up everything he could find on Daniel Miller. The public record was thin. A few prior arrests for shoplifting, a DUI. A grainy high school yearbook photo showed a boy with a vacant smile and troubled eyes. There was a brief article in a local paper from the time of the trial, quoting Miller's distraught mother, who insisted on his innocence before she disappeared from the public record. He found a recent satellite image of the Supermax prison, a geometric scar on a desolate landscape. He would stare at it, trying to imagine what was happening inside those walls. What a man did with his days when he was innocent, but the world had declared him guilty for life. One afternoon, he saw him, Senator Marcus Sterling. It was in the private underground tram that shuttles senators between the office buildings and the Capitol. The car was crowded. Vance was at one end, Sterling at the other, holding onto a pole, looking out the window at the concrete tunnel rushing past. Sterling looked exhausted. The fire of his crusade had been banked but not extinguished. There was a sadness in his posture, a slump in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He was a man in defeat. Vance watched him, a storm of conflicting emotions churning inside him. Contempt, the reflexive response honed over years of political combat, was still there. But it was now joined by something else, a grudging respect, a terrifying envy. Sterling had lost the vote, but he possessed something Vance had just discovered he'd never had, the moral high ground. Sterling had fought for a principle he believed in, and he had been right. Not right in the expedient political sense, but right in a deeper, more fundamental way. He had seen the system's capacity for error, its potential for cruelty, and had tried to temper it with mercy. Vance had denied that possibility, and in doing so, had become an agent of that very cruelty. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting second. Across the crowded car, Vance saw no animosity in Sterling's gaze, only a deep, weary resignation. Vance looked away first, a flicker of shame, of something akin to guilt, causing him to study the scuffed toes of his shoes with intense focus. For the first time, he didn't see Sterling as an adversary, saw him as the keeper of a truth he had refused to see. 2 weeks later, Carter's report came. It arrived not in a manila envelope, but as an encrypted file sent to the burner phone. Vance downloaded it in the dead of night in his office, his heart hammering against his ribs. Carter had been thorough. He had not only confirmed every detail in the Justice Integrity Project's report, he had deepened the wound. He had found the 2 detectives who had coerced the informant. One was dead. The other was retired, living in Florida. A man who, Carter, noted with characteristic cynicism, had a gambling problem and a sudden influx of unexplained income the year after Miller's conviction. Carter had also found Daniel Miller's mother. She was alive, living in a low-income nursing home 2 states away. Her mind ravaged by dementia, still occasionally asking the nurses if her boy was coming home soon. The final page of Carter's report was not data, but a single, chilling paragraph. He had used his contacts to pull Miller's prison medical records. Miller had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was less than 6 months. The system wasn't just going to let an innocent man die in prison. It was going to let him die soon. That was the breaking point. The knowledge moved from the intellectual to the visceral. This was no longer a philosophical problem about justice. It was a race against a clock. A man was dying, his name still stained, his mother still waiting. And Vance held the key to his exoneration, a key forged in the crucible of his own brothers. Murder. He sat for a long time, the glow of the monitor illuminating his pale, drawn face. He thought about the consequences of revealing the truth. His career would be over instantly. He would be destroyed, not by his enemies, but by his own acolytes. The movement he led would brand him a traitor. The land order platform he had built would crumble, and he would be the one holding the hammer. He would bring shame upon his family's name, desecrating his brother's memory in a way he could never have imagined. He would be trading his entire world for the life of one man, a man he had never met. But what was that world worth now? It was a kingdom built on sand, a palace of lies. To remain silent was to become a willing participant in the injustice, was to become the very thing he had always claimed to fight against. The choice was no longer between his career and his conscience. It was between damnation and some faint, distant possibility of atonement. He made a decision. It was not a grand, heroic choice, but a quiet, desperate one. He would not hold a press conference. He would not write a confessional app. The system was too corrupt, the media too carnivorous, his own party too invested in the lie. He could not trust them with the truth. He could only trust one person to understand the full, terrible weight of it all. He picked up his personal phone, his hand surprisingly steady now. He scrolled through his contacts, past the names of cabinet secretaries, billionaires, and party chairmen. He stopped at a name he never thought he would call: Marcus Sterling. He walked out of the Russell building and into the cool night air. He did not take his chauffeured car, walked. He crossed the manicured lawns of the Capitol grounds. The dome lit up against the black sky like a promise he no longer believed in. He walked toward the Hart Senate office building, a modern, colder structure, a place he rarely had cause to visit. He was crossing a line, not just physically, but ideologically, spiritually. He was a penitent walking toward, a confessor he had once tried to burn at the stake. He reached the entrance and saw a single light on in a corner office on the 7th floor. Sterling's office was still there, still working. Vance did not know what he would say. He did not know if Sterling would even see him. He did not know what would happen next. For him, for Daniel Miller, for the country. He only knew that the silence had become unbearable, and that the truth, however destructive, was the only path. Out of the ruins, he held the burner phone in his pocket. The investigator's final report, a dense, heavy weight against his leg. He pushed through the glass doors, his reflection a pale, haunted stranger, moving toward an uncertain reckoning.